Welcome. Let's make a start, everybody. Thanks for coming on this rainy, cold, windy London night, and welcome to everybody online. Guys online, if you have questions, either stick your hand up and Daniel will process that or put the questions in the chat. So it's my great pleasure to welcome a really old friend of mine. Not that he's old, I'm old, but somebody I've known for a long, long time, Eli Friedman from Cornell University. Over at Ithaca in the States. Eli, forgive me, Eli is probably the foremost China labor researcher in the US, working in the English language, and it is really a great honor to have him here. Eli's been publishing in various academic journals on various aspects of labor relations, both in mainland China and in Taiwan and in Hong Kong as well. And his most recent work is looking at the impact, as what he's going to talk about today, really, the impact of China's rise on movements of labor labor movements, social movements in Taiwan and Hong Kong. His previous work has kind of focused on a number of issues around labor and migrant labor in mainland China. The book I found inspiring was The Insurgency Trap, which was looking at how the Chinese state, through its party-controlled trade union, the All China Federation of Trade Unions, had kind of cut off its own development pathway in many ways, looking at its inability of a party trade union to kind of institutionalize any gains that workers were making through their own actions on the ground. Eli will correct me if that interpretation is incorrect. Second book was quickly followed by a second book, Urbanization of People, from Columbia Press, I think, yeah, which is looking at welfare and migration in major Chinese cities. And a third book that's come out recently with another friend of ours, Kevin Lin, and two others, looking at China in global capitalism, building international solidarity against imperial rivalry. How topical. And no guesses for who the imperial rivals are there. That's with Haymarket Press. So without further ado, I'm going to ask you to welcome Eli, and Eli's going to talk for 45 minutes. Shock, boom and bust, China's rise and workers and class politics in Hong Kong and Taiwan. So thank you, Eli.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for welcoming me here. So I want to say at the outset that this is a preliminary take on my research. It may be too preliminary. I'm still working through the archival data, and I've done a lot more research on the 1980s up to the year 2000. Fortunately, I lived through the post-2000 period, and so I kind of intuitively understand a little bit more of that, but I think that part of the research is a little bit weaker. Tim just mentioned this most recent book. Let's see, how do I advance? There we go. He just mentioned this book, China and Global Capitalism, that I've worked on with three wonderful co-authors. Today is definitely not a book, it's not a book talk, but some of the ideas that I'm going to be presenting are presented in kind of schematic form here in the book. And the big question that animates both this book as well as the current research is to try to come to terms both theoretically but also practically with the question of how China's incorporation into global capitalism and subsequent rise within global capitalism has affected workers and labor politics within China, but also outside of China. And today I'm going to be focusing outside of China. I just want to note that I'm going to be referring to China, which basically refers to mainland China, and Hong Kong and Taiwan as separate, and we can debate that decision later on. But ultimately, whatever you feel about that is not really important for the talk. The early ideas behind this research began germinating in the 2010s. And that was because you had protests that were happening all around China's periphery, with uprisings in Tibet in 2008, in Xinjiang in 2009, in 2014, March of 2014 in Taiwan, the Sunflower Movement, and then in the fall of 2014 with the Umbrella Movement in Hong Kong. And since then, in both Hong Kong and Taiwan, we've seen a pretty sharp anti-China turn in politics, both in society and in the electoral sphere in Taiwan, but not in Hong Kong because they don't have that opportunity. So we have this kind of paradox that just as China is emerging on the global stage as a real competitor to US hegemony, if not globally, at least within Asia, is increasingly powerful economically, militarily, and politically, it seems to be losing control of its very own immediate periphery. For my own research, I couldn't possibly do this entire periphery. You can't go to Xinjiang and Tibet anymore. And the fact that you can still go to Taiwan is an important part of why I'm doing this research. But so I'm going to be focusing on what you might think of as the Sinitic periphery of kind of China proper, Taiwan and Hong Kong. I'm also interested in extending the research to Singapore in the future. I'm actually going to Singapore next week to investigate this. I'll say more about that in just a minute, but I haven't done the Singapore research yet. So when we look at these problems that generated on China's periphery, the commonplace understanding, I would say, in the West, but also in Hong Kong and Taiwanese societies, is that it is his fault. Xi Jinping, in this common understanding, Xi Jinping is a dictator, he has centralized power, and he wants to use this increasingly dictatorial power to crush the freedoms that people in Hong Kong have enjoyed and to formally annex Taiwan. And this is certainly a big part of what's happening, and I don't want to sort of understate the extent to which that has actually played a role, and it is certainly a major proximate cause in this anti-China turn in Hong Kong and Taiwanese societies. But it's not as if the Chinese Communist Party's threatening behavior with respect to democracy, and specifically with respect to democracy in Hong Kong and Taiwan, is new, right? In 1989, famously, there was the Tiananmen Square massacre, which people in both Taiwan and Hong Kong were paying very close attention to. In 1995 and 1996, in the run-up to the first democratically contested presidential election in Taiwan, China was shooting missiles at Taiwan in the months leading up to this. In 2003, you had in Hong Kong them pushing Article 23 anti-subversion law, which generated massive protests. I'm going to say more about that in a little bit. So I'm not convinced that this repressive turn under Xi Jinping can fully account for such a noticeable social change that has really happened within the past 10 years in particular. I think that there's something that's changed in terms of how people are reacting to the actions of Beijing and of the PRC government, and in terms of kind of the trajectory of social and political change that they can envision for the future. And that is quite different, I would say, over the last few years than it might have been in the 1990s. It's also important that we also want to understand why Xi Jinping himself has become more repressive, which he has, and there's no debate there. But if you look at the global authoritarian right-wing turn, which is happening in many countries, right? In many senses, Xi Jinping is just a precursor to the things that are happening in many other countries over the past 10 years. Within China, in kind of official discourse and to some extent in academic discourse, to the extent that this anti-China turn in Hong Kong and Taiwan can be discussed openly, there's generally two kinds of explanations. The first one I'm going to call the brainwashed youth hypothesis. And in this thesis, you have young people who have been brainwashed, who have a colonial mindset. And for many people, the development of anti-China media, but also very specifically textbooks and the content of textbooks in both Hong Kong and Taiwan have turned young people against their Chinese identity and have made them more sort of aligned with their former colonial masters, be they British, be they Japanese, or maybe sort of the non-formal colonial master of the United States. But one reason that the particularities of what young people in these societies are seeing, the reason that I don't think that really holds water is that actually this anti-China sentiment is a global phenomenon as well. I'm going to come back. So here we have some data that shows the percentage of people who have a favorable versus an unfavorable view of China. And what you can see, and this is obviously a very limited subset of the countries in the world, the green line, that's the unfavorable one, is going up in every single country in the world, right? Every single rich country in the world. Now, not everybody ends up in as unfavorable a place as the United States. We're at 82%, although Sweden beats us by 1 point. Britain's not far behind. But this anti-China sentiment that we see in Hong Kong and Taiwan is actually directly in line with global trends. And there's one important exception that I want to show you, which is Singapore. Sorry, Singapore is not on here. Singapore is an important exception to this, though, in that, at least as of last year, Singaporeans still had a largely positive view of China. And that's one of the reasons why I want to study that as kind of this outlier among rich countries. Of course, if you do this, if you get the survey data from the Global South, it looks very, very different. People have a much more positive perspective of China, with a very large and very important exception of India, who has very negative perceptions of China. So, so there's that. So that's the kind of the brainwash youth hypothesis. The other hypothesis I'm calling is the depoliticized materialist hypothesis. And this holds that the protesters, these young protesters in Hong Kong and Taiwan, it's not that they really want democracy or that they're even really opposed to China. It's just that they're frustrated by the fact that the cost of housing is too high. People from Hong Kong despise this argument because they think that it overlooks their legitimately and deeply held belief that they actually do care about electoral democracy. They do care about having independent political parties and civil society and all the rest. And I don't always raise that, you have to be careful raising this in activist circles, but I think that there's a really important grain of truth to this, because housing costs in Hong Kong and also in Taiwan are actually completely out of control. Here we have the median house price to house price ratio, right? So the higher it is, the worse it is. And you probably cannot read that, can you? But the city that's all the way on the right is Hong Kong, which blows all the other cities out of the water. And the city right next to it in red is Taipei, right? So these are the two worst cities in the world. And just for comparison's sake, this is London, right? That's a good deal in London. Compared to Hong Kong and Taipei, and way down here is New York City. So just for comparison's sake, right, you can see that Hong Kong is like more than twice as unaffordable as New York City, yeah, that is concerning. The problem, however, is that the worsening material conditions that young people do in fact face in the housing market, in labor markets, growing inequality, et cetera, has come not despite, but because of deeper economic integration with China, and that's really a central point of departure for me. So again, my intuition here is that China's incorporation into global capitalism is important for understanding this kind of social reorganization that's happening, and then the subsequent political eruptions that we've seen over the last decade, which then leads to the central question for the research. Sorry, this is the income inequality data, but you can see it's been going up. Hong Kong is worse than Taiwan. Hong Kong is the top line. So the central question is, how did China's incorporation and subsequent rise within global capitalism impact workers and class politics in Hong Kong and Taiwan? I should say that my intuition about this as an American was informed by the question of Trumpism. And this is the first iteration of Trumpism, which now seems like better days. But what we saw in the United States, when China was really central to the rise of Trumpism, was that you have this displaced and kind of angry working class that articulates the sense of loss as a result of deindustrialization as a problem being first and foremost with China, right? And Trump articulates that really powerfully and in a racist manner. And I sort of imagined that maybe in Hong Kong and Taiwan, you would have a similar sort of process of deindustrialization as a result of China siphoning away manufacturing jobs, and that would be the social basis of anti-China sentiment. And I was very wrong about that. And we'll see why as we proceed. Okay, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna begin with a bird's eye view of the last 30 years, beginning with my periodization. And this is the shock, the boom, and the bust. So the shock is this post-industrial transformation. I say 1980s, and Hong Kong, I date it to 1984, and the signing of the Sino-British Joint Declaration, after which capital really begins to flow from Hong Kong into China. And I date it in Taiwan from 1987, which is the end of martial law, which makes it easier for Taiwanese capital to move overseas. And that goes up through the year of 2000. So there's this initial shock of deindustrialization that's happening in both places, albeit unevenly. We'll get into that. And then you have the boom. And this is the emergence of, I think, a kind of a tentative PRC-centric hegemony from the short 2000s, the very short 2000s, beginning 2001 with the WTO entry of all three places, but most importantly, China. And then the boom years that end, of course, with the economic crisis of 2008. And this is when Hong Kong and Taiwan are kind of drawn closer by the gravitational force of China's economic expansion. And it looks like in the political sphere, and maybe even in the intellectual and cultural sphere, the possibility of a kind of consenting to greater incorporation with Beijing. But that ends pretty quickly, and then you have the period of bust. 2009, the post 2008 economic crisis, which I'm calling post neoliberal fracturing, and the kind of that neoliberal boom begins to unwind. Economic growth is still quite high in China immediately after 2009, but for all sorts of reasons, people in Hong Kong and Taiwan are seeing fewer benefits of that economic growth. And then, of course, growth within China declines, and that leads us all the way up to the present. It's important to note, of course, that politics doesn't really turn on a dime. I have to pick some dates, but you can see some trends that continue past the date that I've picked, or maybe start a little bit before, but please, be generous about the dates. All right, I want to show you some kind of public opinion polling to get a sense of why I see this period of kind of hegemony emerging in the mid-2000s that's quickly unraveled. So if we look in Hong Kong, it's a question that has been asked for many years in Hong Kong, question of identity, right? Do you feel yourself to be a Hong Konger? Do you feel yourself to be Chinese? And you can see in the 1990s, people are actually really uncertain. People don't know what it means to be Chinese in the post-1989 context. It's unclear what one country, two systems, the system that's eventually going to come to govern Hong Kong is going to look like. A lot of people are leaving Hong Kong at the time and emigrating overseas. And so you can see some kind of uncertainty there. But you can see in the kind of the boom period that not only does the kind of Chinese identity hold, which is surprising given that younger people are less likely to identify as Chinese than their parents. So if you see it holding across time, that suggests some kind of political stasis, right? You actually see the Chinese identity briefly overtaking the Hong Kong identity in 2008. And that's because of the Olympics, right? And some of the Olympic events are held in Hong Kong. And so Hong Kong gets some of the sheen of the Beijing Olympics, which China wins. And then you can see in 2009, you can see this big divergence, right? So long before the uprisings of 2014 and 2019, you can see at the level of identity, this kind of anticipation of that difference. People are identifying much more closely as being from Hong Kong. It's another way of looking at this. They ask the question on the whole, do you trust the Beijing central government? Things are a little bit shaky, right? In the 1990s, there's some ups and some downs. Overall, the level of trust is pretty low, though, if you look at the absolute numbers. The green is kind of trust, yellow is quite trust, orange is very trust. People never very trust Beijing, and they should never very trust any government. You can see there's some sort of uncertainty. And then in the boom years, it goes way up, right? And then after 2008, it goes way down. I also just want to point to, you see some weird things happening after 2020, where the numbers go way up and suddenly everybody really trusts Beijing. That has nothing to do with what people are feeling. This institute, the Hong Kong Public Opinion Research Institute, was raided by national security forces and basically told to change their algorithm. And the data looks a lot better for that. It looks better for Beijing, but it is useless for academic purposes. Okay, so that's what's going on in Hong Kong. Taiwan is a little bit different. They ask the questions in somewhat different ways. But here we can again see the question of identity. Do you see yourself as Taiwanese? Do you see yourself as both Taiwanese and Chinese? Or do you see yourself just as Chinese? The purely Chinese identity is in terminal decline long before this, right? In the 1990s, Taiwan is a different social context, earlier waves of migration, and sort of more tenuous connections to the Chinese mainland. I just want to draw your attention to the boom years, right? And again, in Taiwan as in Hong Kong, younger people are less likely to identify as Chinese. And so the fact that this kind of hybrid identity of both Taiwanese and Chinese is at least holding ground over the boom years, I think is significant, that people are open to that kind of a possibility. Now, the divergence happens a little bit earlier in Taiwan than it does in China, where you can see the purely Taiwan identity going up. It goes up in 2008. I think that the Olympics may have had the reverse effect in Taiwan that it had in Hong Kong, because Taiwanese people very explicitly do not enjoy some of the sheen of China winning the Olympics. None of the events are held in Taiwan, et cetera. Right. So anyway, that's just that's just a guess. But this is just to give you some sort of sense about what's happening. You may be interested in seeing the data on support for independence. This is the data is very hard to parse, so I'm going to spare you another one of these line charts. And it really hinges on the question of how we interpret the question, maintain the status quo, right? Which is the overwhelming majority of Taiwanese people want some version of maintaining the status quo. So some people say maintaining the status quo means you are part of China, right? Because they don't have international recognition. Other people will, like Tsai Ing-wen or Lai Ching-te, the current president, will say, no, Taiwan already is an independent country. So maybe if you want to maintain the status quo, that means you do support Taiwanese independence. So I'm going to spare you that, but in 2023, there was a survey by the Taiwanese Public Opinion Foundation. It showed that 49% of Taiwanese people support independence. Most other people want the status quo, and a small and frankly, statistically almost insignificant percentage of people want unification, right? So the kind of the pro-unification, actively, like we want to be a province of the PRC, percentage of the population is basically non-existent. So that's what's happening at the level of identity. What about the structure of the economy between these two societies in China? We look at Hong Kong's trade. And here we begin to see some important differences between these two societies, right? You can see that by the 1980s, China's already Taiwan's biggest, is already Hong Kong's biggest trading partner. That may seem intuitive, especially for those of you who have been born in the last 20 or 25 years. But it's important to note that in the 1980s, China was not the biggest trading partner, right? And that US and European trade was much more important. Hong Kong was extremely outwardly oriented, but you can see that there's a huge increase in Hong Kong's trade with China during the boom years, and it continues to go up even after the dip that we see as a result of 2008. You can also look at Hong Kong investment that's going to mainland China. There is investment that happens prior to WTO entrance in 2001, but you can see that the really big increase is happening again in the 2000s, and it continues to go up. So here what we see is a process of the more or less complete suturing of Hong Kong's economy to China's. At this point, they're completely inseparable, and China's economy is reflected directly in the economy of Hong Kong. In Taiwan, the trade patterns follow the kind of the general trajectory that we see in Hong Kong, but they're a little bit less dramatic, right? China's lower in the 1980s. It increases significantly in the boom years as a result of WTO entry, and continues to rise afterwards, right? So China continues to be extremely important trade partner for Taiwan, but if you look at its relative importance for Taiwan, it's not as important as it is for Hong Kong. You can see that the United States, Japan, certainly the EU, if you had it aggregated there, would continue to be important trade partners for Taiwan. So the relative weight is different a little bit. But here is the big difference. And this is Taiwanese investment that's going to China, whereas in Hong Kong, it's a straight line up. What you can see in Taiwan is that it increases significantly in the boom years, and then it peaks in 2010 and falls significantly off. And I only have the data up till 2020, but it's continued to fall. And now more Taiwanese investment is going to Southeast Asia than is going to China. The other thing that I want to note here, and I've put the political parties that are in power, this is basically the reverse of what you might expect given the stated political preferences of the two political parties. DPP is in power, the presidency of Chen Shui-bian, who's an avowed pro-independence guy, has been, he went to jail, in defense of Taiwanese democracy, says he wants Taiwanese independence, and yet what's happening under his rule, investment is increasing really dramatically. After 2008, you have Ma Ying-jeou in power, who later has said, actually, Taiwanese people can accept unification with China. You would expect him to, and he does, try very hard to increase economic integration between Taiwan and China, and it has just the reverse consequence, right? Investment is actually falling really dramatically. So what you have here is a structural process that's already been set in motion that's relatively indifferent to the stated desires of the political parties that are in power. And the big reason for this is because we have to understand where Taiwanese capital is situated in global supply chains, which is mostly in pretty wage-sensitive, labor-intensive kinds of industries, the most famous being electronics, right? So all of the electronics that are in this room, most of them are going to be produced by some kind of Taiwanese supplier based in China. And what's happening in China at the time, you can see the average monthly wages, they're going up, right? And so if you're in a very wage-sensitive, China's the dark line. Okay? So if you're in a very wage-sensitive industry, it's going to create more incentives for you to relocate to Southeast Asia. And the story for the last couple of years has been major investments in India as well, which is being pushed especially by Apple and some other tech companies. Okay, so that's the kind of the bird's eye picture. What I'm going to do with the remainder of the time is to provide just a kind of a brief sketch of the evolution of processes of class formation, of political representation, and a little bit about geopolitics here and there that's happening in both places across these three different time periods. And we want to do this as a way of understanding the rapid rise and then fall of this PRC-centered hegemony in the 2000s. So let's begin with Taiwan, which I'm calling from Western advance, which I'll explain, to militarization history. Okay, in the period of initial shock in the 1980s, after 1987, the end of martial law, you have a huge amount of Taiwanese manufacturing capital that is very quickly relocating to China, oftentimes illegally, and it has to go through a third destination, which is almost always Hong Kong. Sometimes it can be very difficult to actually know precisely how much capital and how many people are moving between the places because it's not officially recognized as such. But this leads to a very dramatic impact on Taiwanese workers. In 1989, this is the year that factory closures become politically prominent. And I've presented here a picture from the newspaper from the Xinguang textile factory, just kind of on the outskirts of Taipei. And it's this became a major issue. There was a major movement around this particular factory closure. And subsequent to that, we saw a lot of labor struggles that were related to factory closures. And it's worth noting that the kind of more offensive labor struggles had only just taken off in 1987 with the end of martial law. They had about two years where they were making advances, and then they're on their back foot in this kind of defensive posture. But it really becomes part of the national discourse as well. There's a lot of lurid stories of bosses kind of running away to China or oftentimes to Southeast Asia and leaving their workers in the lurch, and a lot of, I think, quite justified anger coming out about that. And so you have this discourse of the so-called Western advance, right, or this Xijin. This means Western advance going across to the west, going across the Taiwan Strait to China. And there is a lot of resistance to this, as I mentioned, and here's some Taiwanese magazines from, I believe from 92, yes, 91, 92. And you can see on the right here that they're having a May Day protest, and the rallying cry for this event is, quote, regretfully parting with labor movement warrior Yan Kun-chuen for his glorious imprisonment. It's kind of a hangover of the authoritarian era of the KMT. A bunch of labor leaders were still going to jail. And Yan Kun-chuen had been involved in a struggle in Kaohsiung. There was a shoe factory that was relocating to China, and they were trying to screw over their workers, and he kind of helped to organize it, and he ended up in jail for a while. By 1995, 1996, these movements against factory closures coheres into a real social movement, and there's an organization called the National Unemployed Workers Federation, Front, Guancang Gongren Lianxian. And they're organizing around the country against these and trying to cohere the power of all these workers that are having their rights violated as the factories shut down, and the majority of them were moving over to China. And one of the things that I think is really interesting here, this is to come back to my point about Trumpism. You might expect in 1995 and 1996, as China's literally shooting missiles at Taiwan, that some people might blame China for this, blame Chinese workers for stealing their jobs. And that is not what is happening at all. There's no mention of China. Nobody cares. They care about the fact that their bosses are violating their laws. They care about the fact that the KMT government is throwing the labor leaders into jail, but it is not articulated in a nationalist sort of way. And that was something that was surprising to me. Politically, so you have a process of democratization that's set in motion from 1987 on. In 2000, for the first time, you have sorry, these are some other pictures I forgot to show you from some of the movements by the unemployed workers. In 2000, you have Chen Shui-bian, who's elected, Time magazine with the not subtle headline, take that Beijing, right? But he's a pro-independence guy. It's the first time someone other than the KMT has governed Taiwan, and he runs on a pretty pro-labor platform. One of the first things that he does when he's in power is he recognizes the Taiwan Confederation of Trade Unions, which is the pro-democracy union federation that did not have legal standing under the authoritarian regime. And yet he ends up governing in the kind of the mold of a third way Clintonite kind of, or Blairite in Britain, kind of neoliberal approach, right? Where he's basically siding with investors and saying what's good for investors is going to be good for the country as a whole. And one of the reasons that he does that, even though he comes up in the kind of the social movement milieu, is because his margin of victory is very narrow, and he feels like he needs to shore up his kind of political bases of power, and so he reaches out to to capitalists, basically, and thinks that he needs his support. And what is the thing that they want? Industrialists want to be able to go to China and invest there, and that's exactly what happens. So if you look at this period in the 2000s, I think it's very curious. So despite the fact that Beijing was very angry about him being elected, again, had been shooting missiles in just the years prior, Taiwan is still continually drawn closer to China. And the reason is that there's just too much money to be made, right? This is when China's economy is growing very strongly. If you look at this period in the middle, average GDP growth is over 10% for many of those years, and Taiwanese corporations are really cashing in. This is kind of the peak era of neoliberal globalization around the world. The old working class back in Taiwan, who had kind of devoted themselves to the so-called economic miracle, they are now quite disorganized. This disproportionately affects female workers and older workers who have less likelihood of finding reemployment. But the aim of the state is for Taiwan to occupy a kind of a higher value-added niche within the global economy. So they can do it can be an R&D center for the high-tech componentry. They can continue to do hot, sort of more capital-intensive, high value-added forms of manufacturing. The clearest example of this is TSMC, which accounts for, I don't even remember, 10%, whole percentage points of Taiwan's economy is just this one company. So some of that is going to be retained in China, in Taiwan, and the kind of the low end stuff, Foxconn, the exploited workers who are sweating away to make your iPhones, that can be sent to China. And some of the benefits of that, this is the proposal from the state, right? Some of the benefits of that will accrue to young people in Taiwan coming into the market who can work, again, in R&D, in management, et cetera. The other thing that's happening is that China opens up its labor market to Taiwanese people, right? So young people who are unable to get jobs in Taiwan itself can go across the strait and work in China. And there's a lot of jobs. And at the time, this is actually seen as a kind of a good career move for young Taiwanese people. They can go work sometimes for Taiwanese companies and kind of middle management, upper management, and bring some of the knowledge that doesn't quite exist within China yet, and they can make some real money. It's difficult to come by good estimates of how many Taiwanese people got jobs in China, because again, there's no official statistics of this. But most people think that by the late 2000s, that there was more than 1 million Taiwanese people that were living in China. Not all of them were working. It could have been, children and what have you, along with their parents. But this is a country that only has 23 million people. So if there was anywhere close to 1 million in China, that is a huge percentage, right? That number subsequently dropped very significantly, and we'll come back to that later. So this, in a way, works really well for Taiwan. It definitely works really well for these corporations. Foxconn goes from a company that nobody's heard of to a global Fortune 500 company. TSMC is valued at, I don't even remember, someone can look it up, but more than $1 trillion, right? I mean, this is very, very successful for many of these electronics firms. Taiwan is getting richer. Its GDP per capita has overtaken Japan, which they're very excited about. But it's also becoming more unequal, which is very important. At the level of politics, okay, so Chen Shui-bian, you'll remember, avowed pro-independence guy. But he more or less assumes a technocratic and neoliberal approach to managing class politics. And he has this quote that I find really evocative. He says, Taiwan doesn't have a so-called right versus left question. It only has the question of unification versus independence. So this is him trying to efface class politics, right? This is the kind of Thatcherite, like there is no alternative kind of approach to thinking about class politics. And he's saying, this is the only thing that we can talk about. But when you're doing this, when you take a neoliberal approach in the context of an economic boom of historical proportion that's happening in China, what that means is that actually you're not even going to be able to address the independence question, because Taiwan is drawn increasingly closer to the gravitational force of China. 2008, Ma Ying-jeou is elected, and he's unabashedly, pro-China. He later says unification is actually acceptable to Taiwan. And this is really the culmination of this PRC-centric hegemony. And I remember being in Beijing when he got elected, and everybody was just kind of like, yeah, this is natural and normal, and this is good, right? We can put the kind of the Cold War mentality behind us. And it's worth noting, this is just kind of a side note, but this kind of PRC-centric hegemony even extends to the labor movement. So the Taiwan Confederation of Trade Unions, which again is the pro-democracy union federation in Taiwan, doesn't have a lot of love for the Communist Party. They're actually doing union exchanges with the All China Federation of Trade Unions regularly in Fujian province as well. So they're interested in building these kinds of connections. But of course, it doesn't last long because we get to the bust and the post-neoliberal fracturing. Of course, this is catalyzed by the economic crisis in 2008. You have a gradual slowdown in growth in China, which makes it harder to paper over some of the social fault lines that have emerged in Taiwan as a result of this neoliberal boom. You see increasing stratification of the labor market within Taiwan, where you have a small number of pretty highly compensated tech workers, particularly in northern Taiwan and Taipei and Hsinchu, Taoyuan, that kind of the tech corridor there. But wages stagnate really badly for most. And in the Chen Shui-bian, neoliberal Chen Shui-bian and Ma Ying-jeou years, minimum wage barely ticks up. So this is the minimum wage. You can see Taiwan in comparison to some other countries. And you can see that over the course of the 2000s, it mostly just now flatlines. Of course, the cost of housing continues to go up quite dramatically. There are also fewer jobs for Taiwanese people in China, in part because capital is beginning to relocate away, but Taiwanese capital is beginning to relocate away from China and going to other places, but also because China can produce its own talent, right? China's been investing heavily in the university system. And so there's lots of people who are able to take those kind of mid-level management jobs, who are able to do R&D and are willing to generally do it for lower wages than the Taiwanese people are, right? So there's fewer job opportunities for them. One estimate that I've seen is that by 2022, so after the pandemic, which is very important, there was only 177,000 Taiwanese people living in China. So, roughly 10%, 15% of what had been there a decade prior. And if you look at what's happening again, just kind of domestically, for people who don't have higher education, who just have kind of a secondary school education, as in every country, every developed country in the world, it's a story I think we're familiar with. There's increasingly just menial service sector jobs that are kind of dead end, low wages, et cetera. Politically, Ma Ying-jeou again is elected in 2008, and he thinks he's ushered in this era of increasing kind of cooperation between Taiwan and China, and maybe even the possibility of some kind of unification. Ma Ying-jeou actually represents the apex, and you begin to see the decline of that dynamic, and really he presides over the collapse of that dream. One of the main things that Ma Ying-jeou does is he pushes for ECFA, the Economic Cooperation Framework Agreement, which is essentially a framework for advancing free trade-like policies between Taiwan and China. China thinks that this will be a big win, that they will give some benefits to Taiwanese companies, and that this will draw Taiwan closer. But increasingly, what we see is that while Taiwanese companies are benefiting, Taiwanese people are not benefiting from that. The big winners so eventually in 2014, he proposes a new cross-strait services and trade agreement, which is really oriented towards getting better access to the China market for finance and some other services, right? So again, a very neoliberal approach to dealing with this. And the response is that you have this movement, the Sunflower Movement in 2014, where a bunch of students take over the Legislative Yuan for several weeks in opposition to this free trade agreement. Now, it's worth noting that this is not framed as really opposition to free trade. The labor movement is pretty absent, and the kind of labor-related or class-related issues are by no means prominent in the discourse. In fact, there is a kind of a left faction that tries to raise some of these issues with the main organizers, and they're basically told to leave. And they're outside of the Legislative Yuan, and they set up what they call like an outcast district. They've produced some very good writing, which I recommend you check out. So the main thing that the movement is focused on is is the political process, right? And they don't like the fact that the KMT has pushed this through with what they refer to as black box tactics, right? That they think that they're trying to avoid scrutiny. And this gets at this whole question of Taiwan's still pretty fragile process of democratization. So there's a way of, and of course, underlying this is anti-China sentiment. You have some people who are certainly diehard, Taiwanese nationalists and don't want anything that has to do with China. They're going to oppose it. That is definitely also current here. So it looks like class politics are not really that important here. But if you look at the main movement party that emerges from this, the New Power Party, and you look at their platform, it's very social democratic in nature, at least, right? It's a left-wing party. They win some seats and eventually end up not doing that well for reasons that are familiar to left parties everywhere. But it's a kind of democratic socialist push at a minimum. After this happens, you have 3 consecutive DPP victories at the national level in 2016, 2020, and now 2024 in the post-Tsai Ing-wen era, a clear social rejection of unification. And so the question is now, what kinds of tools does China have at its disposal to try to bring Taiwan closer, if not economic ones? And so far, their answer has basically been increased militarization of the Taiwanese Strait. So what we see is that over the course of the 2000s, marketization initially brings Taiwan closer to China. That same process of marketization also, I think, is pushing it away. Okay. Still a little bit of time to talk about Hong Kong, where we have from northward migration to the national security crackdown. Okay, so this northward migration refers to the relocation of manufacturing capital from Hong Kong across the border, first just to Shenzhen, just to the north, and then especially in Guangdong, but elsewhere in China as well. This begins a little bit earlier in Hong Kong than it does in Taiwan. Again, I mentioned the Sino-British Joint Declaration, which happens in 1984. This gives Hong Kong capitalists some confidence that there's going to be some regularized mechanisms for dealing with the kind of property disputes that they might, that they might worry about. And the consequence of this is that Hong Kong's manufacturing working class evaporates. So this is manufacturing employment in Hong Kong. In the mid-1980s, this is about 45% of the total workforce, right? By the 2010s, I think it's about 2%, right? And so this is different than Taiwan. Taiwan sees a dip, but it kind of stabilizes around 25 to 30% of the workforce. In Hong Kong, it just goes away. So the unmaking of the working class here is more rapid and more total. And that's for a lot of reasons. It has to do with the kinds of things that they're producing, but it's also Hong Kong's proximity to China, that you can quite literally walk across the border, and you do have capitals kind of going back and forth to manage their factories across the border. Politically, in the 1980s and more so in the 1990s, Hong Kong is going through a belated democratization under the colonial regime and the final governor, Chris Patton. As in Taiwan, there's no Labor Party, and you do have a pro-democracy party that is also quite pro-capital. There are 2 independent labor folks in the legislature in this period of time, Li Chai-kin, who's now in prison, and Lau Chin-shek, and then you have some kind of pro-establishment labor leaders as well. In Hong Kong, in contrast to Taiwan, the key axis of differentiation is not independence versus unification. That is not seen as a realistic conversation in Hong Kong at the time. Everybody thinks that they're part of China. The axis of differentiation is pro-Beijing versus pro-democracy, right? But as in Taiwan, that more or less excludes class politics from discussion. The independent labor movement in Hong Kong gets organized a little bit later than it does in Taiwan. It really comes after 1989 and kind of the shock of Tiananmen. The Hong Kong Confederation of Trade Unions gets set up in 1990, and that kind of coheres a current that is pro-democracy, but also pro-worker and trying to center that kind of class politics. So you have an industrial working class that is badly battered, but also as in Taiwan, it is not the kind of the nationalistic story of those Chinese workers are stealing our jobs, right? It's just these capitalists are stealing our jobs, and a lot of times the workers are treated badly in the process. Part of this, I think, is also because these jobs are always pretty bad. So, if you think about the cultural resonance of, say, an auto worker in Detroit, Michigan, when they lose their jobs, they're losing an identity, a way of life, and a pretty decent way of life that the kind of the mid 20th century class compromise afforded for them. If you're a garment worker in Hong Kong, yes, your life did improve, but this was never a particularly good job, and it was never central to your identity in the way that it was for industrial working classes in the global north. Okay, on to the 2000s and the emergence of the PRC-centric neoliberal hegemony that's happening in the 2000s. It's important to keep in mind what's going on in Hong Kong at the time. The economy is doing quite poorly. So in 1997, you have the Asian financial crisis that has a big impact in Hong Kong. In 2003, you have the SARS crisis, which has a big effect on Hong Kong as well. I'll come back to that in just a second. So there's kind of a real need to get Hong Kong's economy back on its feet, and China provides some sort of opportunity because it's in the midst of. That being said, there are some real fears among the working class about what this closer relationship is going to mean, and I pulled out just one quote here from the Confederation of Trade Unions magazine, and this is co-authored by those two labor leaders and legislators that I mentioned. They said Guangdong Hong Kong integration has been progressing for a while, but the thing that working class residents fear most is that mainland China is like a black hole, sucking up Hong Kong's capital, talent, and employment opportunities. If this kind of integration makes Hong Kong continue to hollow out, the only thing left for Hong Kong will be unemployment, poverty, and despair. So and this is from 2003. So there's anxiety about this. But once Hong Kong kind of gets caught up in this, in the wake of China's really, massive rise that's happening at that period of time, in general, people are kind of satisfied, right? These guys are not going to be satisfied. The labor leaders are never going to be satisfied, but I would say at the social level, Hong Kong is more or less okay with what's happening. You see a kind of a global city kind of dynamic in terms of the transition in employment and the structure of the economy away from manufacturing. And the idea is that Hong Kong will be the kind of command center for Chinese capitalism, and they have this massive hinterland, especially of Guangdong, but of the rest of China as well. And in Hong Kong, you're going to see a lot of creation of jobs in finance, first and foremost, legal jobs, accounting, trade, etc. And that this will create lots of good, highly paid jobs for Hong Kong's youth. As with all global cities, this also intensifies the growth in inequality. And I believe that the only city in the world that's more unequal than Hong Kong is New York, right? And I'm sure London is not far behind. But the economy is much better than it was in the late 1990s. Although the job market is competitive, there's good job growth, and young people feel like they're going to graduate college, they're going to be able to get reasonably good jobs. As with Taiwan, there's also a lot of jobs that are opening up for Hong Kong people in mainland China, and huge percentages of the workforce are employed at least part of the time across the border in China. Politically, the 2000s is the age of mobilization. And many people interpret this as mobilization that's happening at this period of time as laying the groundwork for the massive anti-China mobilizations that we see in 2014 and then 2019. I actually see it a little bit differently. So the first of these big mobilizations was 2003. I already mentioned this opposition to the Article 23 anti-subversion law, when you had roughly 500,000 people in a city that at the time had maybe 7.5 million people. Right, so 500,000 people out there on the street protesting. I don't see this as being a sort of a straight line from this to wanting to be independent of China or being fundamentally opposed to the Chinese government. There's a real sincerity to engage. People are out there and they're protesting, and they're saying, we disagree with this law. And lo and behold, the law was withdrawn for many years. It's now been implemented. So it's not a happy ending, but. So the political parties are certainly very liberal, pro-capital. There's not a kind of a class articulation. But they're continuing to press for democratization in terms of the election of the chief executive, as well as the legislative council, which is only partially directly elected at this period of time. The government is pushing for deeper economic integration, and they passed this thing called CEPA, the Closer Economic Partnership Agreement in 2003, which is basically a free trade agreement between Hong Kong and Taiwan. And you have the labor movement, at least the left wing of the labor movement is certainly critical of this free trade agreement, of some of the privatization efforts that the government is leading in this period of time, but they don't have much capacity to actually resist this, and civil society in general is not opposing these things. And I do just want to mention geopolitically, if you look at Hong Kong's position as it's always been kind of situated between the empires, British Empire and the Qing Empire, and then between the emerging Chinese Empire and the American Empire, in this period of time in the 2000s, there's this real confluence of interests. Washington and London are perfectly happy to allow Hong Kong to continue to play the role that it's played as this kind of financial center, and it allows them to make lots of money in China. And that's exactly what Beijing wants as well, right? They want Hong Kong as a kind of offshore bank, essentially, to be able to do the kind of finance that they can't do within mainland China as well. The government is not really messing too much with the rights that are enshrined in Hong Kong's basic law, which is its mini constitution. So freedom of assembly, academic freedom, freedom of the press, all of those things are actually pretty reasonably protected over the course of the 2000s. So the relationship under this one country, two systems looks pretty stable, and Hong Kong people are feeling more relaxed about joining China than they were, say, after 1989. But things go sideways, right? And you have the economic crisis that happens in 2008. This has a big effect both by affecting Hong Kong capital that is in China, right? Because they're particularly invested in the labor-intensive low-end manufacturing sector that's export-oriented and that is hit hardest by the 2008 economic crisis. And you also see an increasing export of capital from China to Hong Kong. And this is kind of a new dynamic. China is now rich. A lot of that capital is getting invested in housing, right? Because there are not a lot of profitable outlets for capital within China proper. And so a lot of it is going to real estate. A lot of it is going to real estate in China, but a lot of it is also going into Hong Kong, and a disproportionate amount is going into Hong Kong. So Hong Kong is kind of being flooded with capital in a way that is good for the real estate tycoons and is bad for anybody who needs a house. In terms of the jobs that are happening, it's still, it is quite stratified. The kinds of new jobs that are being created are also a function of this flooding of Chinese capital into Hong Kong in the guise of tourism, right? So in this period of time, you also see a deregulation of Chinese tourists going to Hong Kong, and this is a huge boom sector of the economy, and really functionally the only kinds of new jobs that are being created. The kinds of jobs that exist in the sector are bad jobs, right? So it's food and beverage, it's hospitality, it's working in shops, and this generates a lot of anti-tourist sentiment, articulated oftentimes as anti-Chinese sentiment, oftentimes in some really kind of nasty and discriminatory ways. You also see, for young Hong Kong people who are just going into the labor market, you also see increasing competition from Chinese people, who many of them have been schooled in Hong Kong universities, but some of them have been schooled in the UK and the US. They're coming into Hong Kong. They have all of the skills or better skills than the Hong Kongers and are more competitive in the labor market. And it's worth noting that this question of Chinese people from the mainland working in the Hong Kong's labor market has always been extremely contentious in the 1980s and the 1990s. And you actually had both pro and anti-Beijing segments of the labor movement and of the political establishment that were very firmly opposed to it. But that has been an increasing reality. Politically, more and more, the Democratic Party, the pro-democracy party, continues to have this kind of good faith engagement with the system, but social movements very quickly kind of supersede that old pro-democracy movement, and this is seen most clearly with the Sunflower Movement that happens in 24. The socio-political dynamics, I think, underlying this are very similar to what we see with the Sunflower Movement, but are just intensified given basically Hong Kong's proximity to China and to the growth dynamic that's happening there as well. Hong Kong is just more expensive, more competitive, and there's also no hope of political expression via an electoral system that remains pretty firmly under the control of Beijing, at least at the kind of higher levels. As in Taiwan, there's no discussion of class issues, right? Nobody of the umbrella movement is talking about we want better jobs or we want unionization rates or anything like that. But as with the Sunflower Movement, the main political party to emerge from this is a group called Demosisto, which doesn't exist anymore. And if you look at their platform, it's very social democratic, right? They talk about public housing, they talk about reducing the cost of housing, they talk about improving labor rights, and all of that. I can't talk about all the things that happened between 2014 and the protests that happened in 2019, but by 2019, you basically have generalized social revolt. The city becomes ungovernable, but in many ways, it's really just an intensification of the dynamic that already happened in 2014. Geopolitically, of course, by 2019, China is completely unconcerned with what Western countries might have to say about human rights violations. And it's a real reflection of the changing balance of global power. But the policy of integrating Hong Kong peacefully into China's political system via the promise of more growth has failed. In fact, all of the growth that has been generated for Hong Kong capitalists and all of the capital flowing into Hong Kong's space has been a disaster for most people who live there. And so the only option, in essence, for China, for Beijing to deal with what's happening in Hong Kong is a coercive one. So you have massive police violence, you have the implementation of the national security law, you have the liquidation of the political opposition and the evisceration of civil society more generally, and the imprisonment of protest leaders and especially labor leaders, right? I mentioned one of them who's still in prison and there are others. Okay, so just to wrap up here. The argument here has been that in this era of capitalist transformation for China, Beijing hoped that the market would be the means for incorporating, let's just say, most of the territories of the old Qing Empire, minus Mongolia. My argument is that China's incorporation into global capitalism and the astonishing growth that it developed within China almost accomplished that. And even the liquidation of much of the old industrial working class in both Hong Kong and Taiwan didn't slow that process, nor did the election of pro-independence Chen Shui-bian in 2000. So this PRC-centric neoliberal hegemony was looking quite powerful in the mid-2000s. But those market processes subsequently undermined the construction of hegemonic. In contrast to the idea that I started with, that you would have this kind of vengeful, displaced working class a la Trumpism, that would be the social basis of this. In fact, it was a downwardly mobile youth that really only emerges after, as kind of a political force after the 2008 economic crisis. But these social movements against deeper integration with China took very different trajectories in the two places, right? For Hong Kong, it was already too late. The economy was completely sutured to China, the political system more or less captured. Taiwan was very different. The economy, the state had more room for maneuver, structurally speaking, as Taiwanese capital had diverted increasingly away from China. And of course, Taiwan has a liberal political system, which led to successive victories for the pro-independence, or at least pro-Taiwanese sovereignty DPP party. I know I'm over time, but I just want to take one last point here, which is to situate this in the inter-imperial competition that's happening between China and the United States, which is intensifying in surprising and strange ways, but it's certainly not going to get any better for the foreseeable future. You have this inter-imperial competition, but there's no clearly articulated counter-hegemony in the way that Gramsci would think about it, and I can say more about Gramsci if you want to in Q&A. For Taiwan, what Taiwan has decided to do is to tack more in the direction of the West, in the direction of Japan, to try to gain itself some autonomy economically from China. And this can potentially increase its room for maneuver, but it's not going to address the fundamental social problems that are underlying the disruption that we see in Taiwanese society. And I think that's going to leave Taiwanese society kind of open to unpredictable and potentially destructive political currents. This is, I think, a really strong contrast to the post-war hegemony that existed under the American empire. And one thing that I found in the archive that really surprised me is that under the Ronald Reagan administration in the United States was threatening the KMT not to infringe on labor rights, which, if you know anything about what Ronald Reagan was doing to American workers at the time, is very ironic, because they were not being treated so nicely. But in any event, if we think about it today, it's not clear to me that either of these imperial poles offer a kind of a solution to the social disillusion that we see in Hong Kong, in Taiwan. And so I think that we're going to likely see ongoing internal social disequilibrium. I'll leave it at that. Look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Eli. That was a really rigorous look at the political economy of this huge dissolution, if you will. Daniel, you're going to tell me if any questions come up online, yeah? And I'll ask you to read them out. Is that okay? Because you've got access to them. But let's open. I've got a couple of questions, but let's open it up. Any questions, contributions? Yes.
Yeah, I got one. I'm Clark. I'm an undergrad student from Waseda University in Japan. And I have a question mostly about the future rather than, what has happened up until now.
Sure.
And we've noticed that, China's population pyramid is suggesting an impending demographic crisis in China. You've talked about this kind of erosion of the industrial working class. And for China, a country that's quite deeply rooted in manufacturing right now, right? What do you think that would mean for kind of China in the future economically? Because this was kind of discussion about integration of Hong Kong and Taiwan into China economically and politically. But do you think that if it hasn't worked out that well to integrate Hong Kong and Taiwan into China, do you think they would look elsewhere for other places to try to integrate into their hegemony to try to counteract this potential lack of ability to continue their current status quo?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. Academics are always nervous about trying to predict the future, and I am nervous about it as well. But I think the first thing to be said about the China's, well, the labor force is already shrinking, right? And there's no hope that there's going to be a population boom. In contrast to Western societies, we're obviously having problems with the question of immigration, and there's no consensus about that anymore. But in China, there's absolute consensus about no immigration, right? And you can see that reflected, I think, in other ways in East Asia. Some countries are a little bit more open to it than others, but China's not going to do large-scale immigration. Even if they did, frankly, there's not enough people to fill the hole that they're going to have in their labor market. It's not like being the UK, and you can say, well, we'll take 0.5% of the population of Nigeria, and that's going to deal with our labor. No, China is a massive country. There aren't enough people in the world for that route to kind of make sense. The second thing, and I'm going to come to your, I think to the final point in just a second. The second point that I think is really important to underline here with this demographic crisis is it is going to be expressed as a reinforcing of a very, I think, severe and authoritarian form of patriarchy. And we've already seen that, right, with the state trying to discipline, first and foremost, women into assuming traditional gender roles. And we saw this year before the Lunar New Year that the government said we're going to ban any discussion that is opposed to marriage and childbirth, right? You can't be talking about, I'm not going to get married, I'm not going to have children. They're telling them, well, your job is to get married and have children. And this is not a thing that's unique. I mean, this is Elon Musk this is his hobby horse. He loves talking about when they're educated to have children. So I think internally that's another major effect. But your bigger question is essentially, would it be possible for China to establish a kind of hegemonic relationship with countries on its periphery? And I think that this is a big and open question, right? And I want to be clear that nothing that I'm about to say is meant as justification of American empire in East Asia. But as I kind of alluded to, what you saw in the post-World War II era under the kind of the umbrella of American hegemony is that there was a kind of developmentalist ethos that resulted in real material improvements for workers. It was unequal and was oftentimes extremely brutal and anti-democratic. But if you look at the kind of the good faith that American empire has in a lot of East Asian countries still today, remarkably, part of it is, I think, explained by the fact that there was a project that really improved people's lives. And so the question is, again, this is compromised in all sorts of ways, but the question is, can China do that today? And I think that there's a lot of things that are probably outside of the control of like the guy in Beijing who's going to be making the decisions, not just Xi Jinping, but lots of people, because the structure of the global economy is very different than it was in the mid-20th century. The results so far are really not good, right? Hong Kong and Taiwan, one of the things that is, I think, different is that these are places that are richer than China. And incorporating places into that kind of hegemony when they are richer is, I think, much more difficult. So I think in answering your question, the places that you would want to look, first and foremost, would be Southeast Asia, right? Where China already is the biggest trading partner for a lot of places. I think Latin America is another place to look where China's overtaken the United States as the biggest trade partner. You know, the results are really not that good. If you look at Cambodia, which is as close to kind of a vassal state as China has, you know, it's still kind of low end, pretty brutal manufacturing. There's no unions. Is there a kind of a virtuous cycle of, you know, rising wages, general improvements in material conditions for the working class in Cambodia? I don't really see that. Myanmar, no, right? And if you look at some of the things that is happening in Latin America, it looks pretty similar to the typical kind of extractivist model where we're taking natural resources and most of the benefits are accruing to a Chinese corporation, right? It's a Chinese corporation rather than an American one now. But so I think that there's kind of not super robust material basis for that kind of hegemony.
You got a question online there? No. Okay. Yes.
Are you seeing any labor action happening in Hong Kong and Taiwan in response to Chinese capital flowing in the boom period?
So no, not directly, and certainly not articulated as such. In this boom period in the 2000s, so you know it's a tough time for the labor movements in both places. You know, Hong Kong, you have there's a barbender strike that happens, which is in 2007. Is that 2007?
A bit earlier, I think.
Which is kind of the biggest, I think, politically most significant thing. It really has nothing to do with China, right? This is a kind of a Hong Kong story. Their wages have been repressed. You do have a somewhat more interesting strike that happens in 2013 among the dock workers. This is not really a China story, but this is I think the biggest and most important strike that has happened in Hong Kong for many years. And there you have a company that is owned indirectly by Li Ka-shing, who's the richest man in Hong Kong and at one time the richest man in Asia. One of the reasons that he was doing so well with the port business is connected to China, because before the ports in Shenzhen and Guangzhou and other places were very developed, a lot of the things that were being produced in China was going out through the Hong Kong port. At one point, I think the Hong Kong port was the busiest in the world, and it began to see relative decline as some of these mainland Chinese ports increased their capacity. But so he was making a lot of money off of that, and the workers their wages were very stagnant. And one of the things that I think is interesting, this is happening in 2013, just before the umbrella movement in 2014, it really became a social movement. And you saw not just unions, but civil society groups, students that were getting involved. And it had kind of, I think, pretty big resonances for just like a straightforward labor conflict that you very rarely see in Hong Kong, but even in a place like, you know, the United States, you don't see that very often. But I don't think it's fundamentally about China, and it was definitely not articulated as such. And Taiwan's a different story, but you know, the short answer is no. The Taiwanese labor movement has continued to be very in a bad state of disarray for a long time.
Yeah, let me ask a quick question, if I may. You placed your talk very much in a kind of how Hong Kong and Taiwan have responded to China's expansion. And I have two questions really. One is to try and flip that a little. And do you think there's any way that what has happened in the way civil society, trade unions, class politics, or lack of class politics in Taiwan and Hong Kong has responded to China's rise, and the movements that we've seen, both in the pictures here, the strikes, etc., some farm movements in Taiwan, has that impacted on policy in China, on Beijing's decision? So in effect, I'm flipping the question.
Yeah.
And the second point I wanted to raise, or question is you're tracing a growth in anti-Chinese sentiment. Now, I'm going to focus on Hong Kong really, so I never really about Taiwan there. But I want to argue that there was always anti-Chinese sentiment in Hong Kong. There was, in fact, you can't really call it racism because it was the same race, but it was, you know, appalling anti-mainland discrimination that we saw in the right of abode, when you saw terrible headlines around against mothers who were having whose children were born in Hong Kong, and Hong Kongers were demanding they be sent back immediately, etc. So I'm wondering if that what we now see is a clearly identified anti-China sentiment, if that wasn't always there,
Yeah.
and why did that suddenly become almost morph into I would say that, you know, people push back if you think I'm wrong, a largely impossible demand among some people, still a minority in Hong Kong, for independence. You know, what's happening there? Like, surely that isn't just in response to Beijing, it's something else going on inside Hong Kong civil society.
Yeah. Okay, great question. I don't know the answer to the first one, so I'm going to answer the second one first, and maybe I'll come up with something. Yeah, so definitely the anti-Chinese sentiment has always been a part of Hong Kong society, probably more strongly in Taiwan. I mean, you know, Taiwan it's a nationalist government. Everybody's indoctrinated with, you know, the communist bandits, and I mean, it's a very strong kind of, if not maybe not anti-Chinese, I think is maybe not the way to think about it, because it is a Chinese nationalist sentiment in Taiwan that's saying we're part of this China. It's anti-communist sentiment, and there's a slight difference that I think over time matters less as they become less communist. So it definitely exists in both places, and I think the question when we think about racism, discrimination, any kind of social hierarchy, is how is it that they gain kind of political force at particular times and not others, right? So I know, like, I'm sorry to be the American and keep going on about Trump, but I have to think about it a lot these days, and so do you. There's always been anti-immigrant racism in the United States, right? Why is it that in this particular moment it gets articulated with such force? And I don't need to talk about the United States, but I think in the context of Hong Kong, it's really, people can be a little bit more relaxed about it. Like, we can have some interpersonal discrimination where I see a Chinese person, I see someone speaking Mandarin or not waiting in line or whatever the kind of, you know, discriminatory things that they had about the way that mainlanders would behave. And I might think to myself, oh, this person is uncivilized or crass or whatever. And then I go home and complain about it to my family and I get on with my life. That's one thing. Why then, and this is really your question, which I don't have a great answer to, why does it become the basis of these social movements beginning in the 2010s, and the kind of shocking to many people emergence of a Hong Kong independence movement, which is absurd on the face of it. Of course, Hong Kong can't exist without China, but it is a real current and felt really deeply among young people. And to come back to sort of something that I said at the beginning, I think that you have to be able to imagine some kind of different trajectory of your relationship to China. And previously, people would sort of say, well, these these mainlanders are kind of uncivilized, but China's growing really quickly. I own a textile company, you know, I can get them to work hard and my life will be okay. So I don't have to organize my entire politics around opposing China. I think for people who are growing up in the 2000s, China just doesn't offer them those same kinds of opportunities, right? And so the full rejection becomes much more important. You may be familiar with in 2015, so just after the umbrella movement, there was a statement that was put together by a long list of student groups who were saying, we're not going to participate in the normal May Day rally that's organized by the CTU, right? And they had participated many years before, and they were basically saying, you guys have no idea what you're doing. You're invested in some process of democratization that's never going to happen. And we need something different. So they put together a list of demands, and the list of demands, and again, this is in 2015, were some labor demands, but the very first demand that they put was keep Chinese people out of Hong Kong, right? And that was a really remarkable shift. It was not the first time that people, it was not the first time that people complained about it, but it was the first time that they put it as the first political demand. In terms of the question about how things that are happening in Hong Kong and Taiwan affecting Beijing's decision-making, Yeah, definitely. But I think again, if you can look at the structural relationship, Beijing has a different sort of sense of the possible. So Chen Shui-bian is elected in 2000. People are like, well, are we going to go to war now? And certainly the things that the Communist Party is saying after he's elected is not friendly. They're not saying, well, we look forward to deepening ties with Taiwan. Like, no, they loathe this guy. But they also understand that they have some other tools at their disposal, right? So they can see this event, which is Taiwan centered, and they can say, but what we're going to do is we're going to offer Taiwanese companies generous benefits. We're going to continue, we're going to get this framework together. It doesn't happen until Ma Ying-jeou's in power because they're not having direct communication with Chen Shui-bian. But there's a framework kind of in the waiting room for a free trade agreement. And as soon as Ma Ying-jeou's elected, then they can kind of roll that out. So I think that they can take a more kind of relaxed attitude to it. They do not feel relaxed now, right? You know, Lai Ching-te gives his kind of his victory speech, and it's actually like pretty banal. And they're sending jet planes, right, over Taiwanese airspace. They're fully surrounding the island now with warships. He hasn't declared independence. He hasn't said I'm going to do anything, but it's just his existence, because I don't think that they see other kinds of tools at their disposal anymore. So I think that the things that are happening in each of these societies has an effect, but it's kind of there's certain kinds of limits that are put on it by the tools they have at their disposal.
Yeah, just quite a quick question. You mentioned that Taiwanese investments in China mainland are decreasing. I'm just wondering, with the growing militarization of the Taiwanese straits, then you've got the Trump administration and growing trade protectionism. Where is Taiwanese investment going now, both inward and outward, actually? So who's it trading with, and what's the future of that likely to be, given the current climate?
Yeah. So there's a lot of pieces to this puzzle. They're doing a lot more trade with the United States, with Europe, and with Japan, and they're trying to encourage that. I should say that this is not the first time this happened. So Tsai Ing-wen implemented what she called the new southbound policy, right, to try to encourage Taiwanese capital to relocate from China and to go to the south, right? So to especially go to Southeast Asia, to go to India, a little bit to Oceania. This is a rehashing of a policy that Lee Teng-hui, who was president in the 1990s, tried to do, which was called the southbound policy, where he was like, Lee Teng-hui didn't want the investment going to China, right? I think I couldn't even get into this in the talk. But the first southbound policy was precisely the same, and it was a complete failure because China was just much too attractive, and so the capital couldn't be kind of prodded. But they are now. So big sites of investment for a long time have been Vietnam has been a big one, right? And if you look at the effects of the US-China trade war, Vietnam has been the big winner. It's not just Vietnamese, it's not just Taiwanese capital though, it's also Chinese capital that is leaving China and going to Vietnam to try to get around the tariffs. Of course, now people are thinking, well, maybe Trump is just going to put tariffs on Vietnam. The man loves tariffs. So, that's a possibility. But there's been a lot there. There's been a lot in Indonesia. And I already mentioned India. There's always, every few years, there's a question of like, is this India's time for industrialization and for economic takeoff? There are some signs that it is a little bit more real, that it has a little bit more legs this time. 25% of iPhones, I think, are going to be produced in India by the end of this year. That's a pretty significant proportion. The government is kind of taking steps to ensure that they have the infrastructure and the labor necessary. It is, of course, a national government in India that's very hostile to labor, which I'm sure the Taiwanese companies will appreciate. And so it seems like there's a kind of constellation of actors that's coming together, not just Taiwanese, but especially Taiwanese companies. And then the other thing, just in the context of the trade war and Trump being back in office, is that Taiwan wants to assure the United States that they're going to continue to invest a lot in the United States. So TSMC already has a plant in the United States in Arizona that is producing not the 2 nanometer, I think the most advanced chips that they have, but the 3 nanometer. So like just one prior generation. And they're doing that as a way to sort of say to the United States, don't worry, like we want America to be able to produce chips. People in Taiwan feel very complicated about that. They refer to the TSMC and that whole ecosystem as the silicon shield, right? Because it's the thing that protects them from Chinese sort of military invasion, because if something happens to Taiwan's chips, then the whole world suffers, is kind of the idea. So taking some of that Silicon Shield and putting it in the United States within Taiwan is actually very politically contentious. And so I think that's not a foregone conclusion, but I think that they also feel like right now, they're a little bit on edge, and so they might make some compromises with Trump.
I have a question about the Taiwanese agriculture aspect, because I think you mentioned about the industrial aspect, but not the agriculture aspect. If I remember correctly, a bit ago, like Chinese government will be banning the import of pineapple.
Yeah.
Taiwan was that kind of things. So I wonder do you think that these kind of restrictions of the agricultural import from Taiwan to China gonna affect like sentiment toward China in Taiwan?
Yeah. So Beijing is very conscious about trying to use the economy as both a carrot and a stick, right? So the overwhelming tendency from the 2000s on, and especially under Ma Ying-jeou, was to try to give Taiwanese companies and Taiwanese producers preferential access to the Taiwanese market. So when they implemented ECFA, they talked about the sort of the early harvest was the phrase that they used. And they're very explicit. We're going to give Taiwan more than China is going to get in return in these trade deals, right? But they also try to use it as a stick. So when the Taiwanese government is doing something that China doesn't like, then they will punish some of them, right? So banning the pineapples, they controversially, I don't know, banned, put tariffs on, banned. Can't remember now. But they've also targeted other kinds of products. The Gaoliang, Gaoliang, it's a kind of alcohol, right? And some other agricultural products. I think some kind of fish, grouper maybe. But they're doing it in a way that they think is, I think, very precise and targeted. So they're trying to target the kinds of districts within Taiwan that might flip KMT, so that they think that, well, the DPP is in power, we're going to punish these particular people, and then they're going to say the DPP is failing us, and so we're going to vote KMT next time, and so that they can flip those particular districts. I think the results are very mixed, right? Because yes, you have these farmers who in the short term can have their interests damaged, although many of them have also found new markets. They're exporting more to Japan or other places, and it turns out they didn't need the Chinese market as much as they thought. Sometimes it really does damage their interests, but if it's a relatively small number of growers, right? How many people are growing pineapples in Taiwan versus how many people are reading in the news that China is behaving in this kind of vindictive manner? I think that the political consequences of that are not straightforward. But it's as a general point, I think it's worth underlining that they're can use the economy in this kind of coercive way. The other thing that they did under Tsai Ing-wen was to prevent Chinese tourists from going to Taiwan. And much like Hong Kong, not as kind of intense a dynamic as it is in Taiwan, but the Chinese government sort of said, well, we're going to give you this gift. We're going to allow Chinese tourists to come to Taiwan. There's an anthropologist in Taiwan, a guy named Ian Rowan, who's written a lot about this. And he's very clear, he does all this ethnography. He says, this has definitely made their job much harder. That similar to what we saw in Hong Kong, there is that kind of underlying anti-Chinese discrimination that is oftentimes intensified by having these face-to-face, person-to-person exchanges, which were kind of imagined to make things better. And it also has an economic consequence. Tourism can be very destructive for local economies. I live in Spain right now. There's these massive anti-tourism protests. They're going around and shooting tourists with water guns, right? This was happening in Barcelona. Because first of all, tourists are annoying, any tourists. And second of all, if you look at the way that they're inserted into the economy, it's Airbnb, hotels, restaurant, these are not great jobs, right? And so even if money is coming in as a result of it, it doesn't necessarily buy you a kind of a social basis that's heavily invested in it. Yes, the hotel owners, the restaurant associations, all these people might be invested in it. But socially, I don't think that it creates that kind of a constituency. So when China said, we're not going to allow tourists to go to Taiwan anymore, those kind of hotel associations, they were upset. Taiwan's economy was fine, actually, and it continued to grow, and a lot of Taiwanese people were happy about it. So I think it kind of backfired a little bit.
We have one question online. Thank you, Professor Eli. I find the presentation very comprehensive with great attention to details, especially the events happening in Hong Kong and Taiwan over the concerned period. According to the latest news, the Hong Kong government is proposing to tighten labor union laws. Note that many are left with many leaders in jail or in exile on national security grounds. What do you think this new proposal is going to impact on the labor market, given the characteristics of Hong Kong labor market, local labor vs foreign labor? On the other hand, with what has been happening in Hong Kong over the past 10 years, how do you think this is going to impact the policy in Taiwan and her labor market?
Sorry, say that last part again.
On the other hand, with what has been happening in Hong Kong over the past 10 years, how do you think this is going to impact policy in Taiwan and her labor market?
Yeah, I'm not really sure about that. Let me talk about Hong Kong first. So they came up with some proposal, I think yesterday, to further tighten the rules around trade unions and to say that registering them requires some additional level of scrutiny and particularly spending and any support that they might get from foreign sources, outside forces, I think they call it. You know, it's irrelevant. I mean, the state already has all of the tools that they need to repress labor. And the labor movement that they want to repress has more or less been repressed. This is just, I think, another kind of signaling. Like, don't think that just because the national security law was passed almost 5 years ago that we're letting up. But they're going to continue to look at that. The national security law. So there is a real thing, which is that some of the organizations, the labor organizations in Hong Kong, have received foreign funding, especially from the United States, but also from European sources. And that is a true thing. Whether or not you think that that threatens national security, I think can be debated. I think it does not. But they've taken care of that, right? All those organizations have either stopped receiving that funding or have kind of dissolved. I don't think that this spells the end of the labor movement, and Tim is more qualified, having written about this. But you know, there was a big upsurge of labor organizing that happened in Hong Kong in 2020, or 2019, and into 2020 during this movement. And a lot of that has been repressed. But from friends that I have who are on the ground in Hong Kong, I understand that there are still some things that are happening, that people are still talking to each other. It has to be much quieter. It has to be non-political. You can't be sort of saying we're going to combine the workers' struggle and the struggle for democracy in the way that the Confederation of Trade Unions did during the 90s and 2000s. That's off limits. But there's still labor organizing that's happening. Yeah, and the second part of the question about how it's going to affect Taiwan, I'm not really sure. I fully understand the question. Beijing has no capacity or interest in affecting labor regulations within Taiwan. That's not their concern. They definitely don't like the pro-independence labor movement or the pro-democracy labor movement, but it is frankly quite small and weak and has very little impact on the general political orientation within Taiwan.
We have one more from Alex.
Online and one question about you go first, Daniel.
What are the chances of the global monetary and fiscal reform? Is war inevitable to your view?
Global monetary and fiscal reform?
Just like that. And he added, is war inevitable?
Is war inevitable?
Yeah.
I don't know about fiscal. I'm not exactly sure what that question refers to, nor am I qualified. I'm also not qualified to talk about war. But no, war is not inevitable. It's never inevitable. We have choices. So something I mentioned earlier is that the majority of Taiwanese people want to maintain the status quo. Some say, I want to maintain the status quo and move a little bit more towards independence. Some say, I want to maintain the status quo and see what happens at some indefinite point in the future. But whatever. There is social consensus within Taiwan that they want things to stay more or less the way they are. Maybe secretly some people would like to, have a new flag or, whatever. But there's no reason that can't happen. There is no hard kind of structural reason pushing these two places towards war. China and the United States continue to make a series of very terrible decisions about how to mediate their relationship. But China will be perfectly fine if it doesn't formally annex Taiwan. The United States will be perfectly fine if it doesn't insist on a big ramp up in militarization, or even stationing American troops in Taiwan. And American politicians do stupid things all the time. I mean, sometimes like someone just mentioned pineapple. When the last Trump administration, Mike Pompeo, who was our Secretary of State, made a big show of they banned pineapple, and he was on Instagram eating pineapple. And he said, "We love Taiwanese pineapple." It's just like, you know, just to antagonize China, right? Like, so I think if those two countries are willing to not be foolish, there is no reason that there has to be a war, but they are often acting quite foolishly, which means that there is a risk of war.
Right, so any more questions after this question here? Yeah, 1, 2, say any more? And then we'll have to wrap it up, time's cracking on. So take your question first, and then the question at the back, take 2 at once and ask you to respond.
Okay, China doesn't have foreign migrants, but China has internal migrants. So many migrant workers, they work in Hong Kong or Taiwan factories. So is there had any relationship with China's labor movement or even social movement with Hong Kong and Taiwan? And another thing is like Guo Taiming, he's the boss of the Foxconn. So like China's labor movement, will China's labor movement have some impact on Taiwan's policy toward China?
Yeah, you shared with us these macro social trend lines in your graphs earlier. Just wondering to what extent, if any, has COVID impacted those macro trends?
All right, let me deal with that question first. I think the answer is a lot, right? So, here, this is the one you're referring to, yeah?
Well, the whole family of charts that you showed, the trend lines, you shared several pages of it, but just COVID's impact, would we be talking about a very different situation now? Had COVID, the pandemic not occurred, yeah.
So I'm curious to see what these numbers would look like today. Again, in Hong Kong, it's almost impossible to get accurate numbers, polling numbers now because of the political situation. But in all these cases, you can see that in 2020, like things get a lot worse. Like Australia is kind of like so-so on China, and then they're like, we hate you, right? And the UK, you can see a big spike in 2020. Even absent that, the trend line is not good for China in most of these places. And one of the things that I think is quite interesting is if you look in Japan, is South Korea here as well? Yeah. Well, I guess Japan, the trend is clear, but you can see that it's going up long before COVID, right? And these are places that are more affected, more proximate to China's rise in various sorts of ways. So I think COVID had a big impact. Of course, in the United States and in every Western country, there was a lot of anti-Chinese racism that came out as a result of that. And I think that certainly had an impact on it.
COVID also occurred right in the midst of the 2019 protests.
Yes.
It took the wind out of that. So that's why.
Yeah. In Hong Kong in 2020, there was a moment when they had 2 laws. One law that required wearing masks for COVID, and one law that banned wearing masks because of the protest, which I think neatly captures the kind of the drama of 2020 in Hong Kong. So yeah, absolutely. And it's a complicated issue, but probably the most important labor event to come out of that whole movement was a strike by healthcare workers in the beginning of 2020, demanding that Hong Kong close the border with mainland China because they didn't want people coming in. Now, some of this, maybe this is a good public health policy. Some of it also was very clearly discriminatory, and they're saying Chinese people are dirty and they have viruses and we want to keep them out. So, but yeah, COVID is a big part of the story for sure. Okay, on this question, okay, the first thing that I have to mention very briefly is actually China does have foreign migrant workers, not very many. And a student of mine wrote a great paper on Vietnamese migrant workers in China. I don't know if the program has been restarted after COVID, but as of 2019, they had approved, or as of 2020, they had approved 300,000 Vietnamese workers to work in Guangxi province, which is this kind of like shadow guest worker program that nobody really knows about, including within China. There are some, Filipino workers, and there are some other undocumented Southeast Asian workers, but it is absolutely, you're right, a marginal part of the overall workforce. One of the things that I think is really interesting, so you're absolutely right. Millions of Chinese workers are in these Hong Kong and Taiwanese invested factories. I don't know if it's still the case, but at least as of a couple of years ago, Foxconn was the largest private employer in China. They had, I think, 1.2 million employees at the peak. One of the things that I think is really interesting, and I come at this because that's the research that I was doing before I started this project, was looking at those internal migrants within China. One of the things that I think is interesting is that in this case, I've approached it from the perspective of Hong Kong and Taiwanese workers and saying, well, look, there's kind of economic reasons why they don't have a lot of good feelings about China. I think actually the same thing is similar for Chinese workers. If you look at what Chinese migrant workers' direct experiences are with Hong Kong and Taiwan, the kind of modal experience is being brutally exploited by a Taiwanese boss, right? And you saw in 2014, one of the biggest and most important strikes to happen in the era of marketization in China was at the Yuyuan factory, which is part of the Baocheng shoe conglomerate, largest shoe manufacturer in the world. You had 40,000 people on strike at one point because the Taiwanese bosses were not paying the pensions. Taiwanese bosses have a terrible reputation in China. And I have a whole archive of all the different posters and stickers that people were putting up, and a lot of it was very aggressively anti-Taiwanese. They were calling them Taiwan Lao, which is like, not like the meanest thing that you can say, but it's definitely like we're identifying our boss via their kind of Taiwanese ethnicity or identity. But if your only experience of Taiwanese people is the manager who's telling you to work harder and they're going to pay you less, like you're probably not going to have a lot of good feelings. And so I think that there's something about the dynamic where, the people who were deeply invested in bringing this relationship closer together was the Communist Party for political reasons, because they have to do this, and the Taiwanese capitalists who wanted to do it because they wanted to make money. But if you look at the actual person-to-person interactions that emerged out of that form of engagement, it's pretty negative, I think, on both sides, which is I think interesting. I don't really have that much data on that, but it's just kind of a thought that I have. Yeah, I think that's it.
Okay, we're gonna have to wrap up now. Can you join me in thanking Eli again once more?